The push for a COVID-19 vaccine for everyone. Less wealthy nations want patent restrictions suspended so they can mass produce the jabs. So why is it not happening? And who should own the rights to make and distribute medicines during a global health crisis? This is Inside Story. Hello and welcome to the program. I'm Dareen Abughaida. Much has been reported about the unequal access to COVID-19 vaccines around the world. The 10 wealthy nations have secured the majority of supplies. Developing countries say part of the problem is that drug makers are controlling production and they're blocking access to information about how they're made. South Africa, India, and more than 100 nations want the World Trade Organization to waive patent restrictions so they can mass produce the vaccines. Well, that's facing opposition from the United States and some European nations where firms, including Pfizer and AstraZeneca, are based. The global vaccine market is estimated to be worth nearly $60 billion a year. Famita Miller sets up our discussion from Johannesburg.
30 seconds, I want to swap that.
It's been a year since the first COVID-19 infection was identified in South Africa. Since then, more than 50,000 people have died here and 1.5 million have been infected. While richer nations roll out vaccines, the program in South Africa has been much slower.
No person, no country, and no region must be left behind. Another important step is to enable the transfer of medical technology for the duration of the pandemic. This will allow us to increase the production of COVID-19 vaccines and other medical products.
South Africa and India are leading a movement to suspend the World Trade Organization's agreement on intellectual property rights for COVID-19 vaccines. But many high-income countries, including the United States and those in the European Union, have rejected the idea. They say waiving the patents would put off private investors and slow down scientific innovation. And existing regulations allow drug manufacturers to make their own deals with generic manufacturers. While some developing nations like Ghana, Ivory Coast and Lesotho have begun receiving their first doses through the UN-backed vaccine sharing scheme known as kovacs, many others in Africa are being left behind.
There is the capacity for pharmaceutical companies to produce these life-saving medical tools. It is essential that the wealthy states stop blocking or putting in legal barriers and delaying this essential proposal ahead of the TRIPS Council at the World Trade Organization.
According to the United Nations, 3/4 of all COVID-19 vaccines have been secured by just 10 countries, all of them wealthy. 130 countries, that's about 2.5 billion people, have not received a single dose. This is not the first public health emergency that South Africa is facing. It has one of the highest HIV/AIDS rates in the world. In the 1990s, millions of people in this country and other developing nations died without access to the drugs they needed, simply because they were too expensive. South Africa is once again calling for access to cheaper drugs to save lives, with some arguing that despite COVID-19 vaccines being tested in Africa, many nations on the continent still remain at the back of the queue. Famita Miller, Al Jazeera, Johannesburg.
Well, the head of the International Federation of Pharmaceutical Manufacturers and Associations says intellectual property, or IP, is not the reason for supply shortages.
But everybody who knows about vaccine manufacturing and was addressing the bottlenecks knew that IP is not the issue. The bottlenecks are the capacity, the scarcity of raw materials, scarcity of ingredients, and it is about the know-how.
So, as you've been hearing, India and South Africa want a waiver on a WTO agreement. That agreement is known as TRIPS. The 1995 provision sets basic global standards on protecting copyright, industrial designs, patents, and trade secrets. For example, a patent for a new drug must be enforced for at least 20 years. And during that time, competitors are restricted from making, using, or even selling it. Now, countries can decide what to protect and allow some exemptions to the rules. The issue came to a head in 2001. That's when developing nations argued the restrictions made HIV treatment too expensive, particularly in sub-Saharan Africa. The WTO then declared that during national emergencies, countries can allow companies to use patents without permission. Let's now bring in our guest. Joining us from London is Max Lawson, who's the head of inequality policy at Oxfam International. And with us from New Delhi is Rajeshwari Hariharan, an intellectual property lawyer and legal counsel for Natco Pharma. And joining us from Barcelona is Jeffrey Lazarus, who's the head of the Health Systems Research Group at the Barcelona Institute for Global Health. Thanks for joining us. Welcome to Inside Story. Max, let me start with you. You say there is huge support to remove intellectual property or IP. And this movement is gaining ground when it comes to the coronavirus vaccine. Tell us why you say that and what you're basing that on.
I think when you see the number of countries now supporting South Africa and India at the WTO, over 100 countries, you're seeing people like the Pope intervene in favour of doing this. We're hearing behind the scenes that cracks are appearing in some of the richer country governments. Nancy Pelosi, the head of the Democrats in the Senate, came out in favour just last week. So I think we are seeing momentum building, and it's no surprise really, because the whole world can see the level of vaccine apartheid in front of our eyes, and no matter what pharmaceutical companies might say to the contrary, it's quite clear that they are not fixing this problem. And we cannot have a situation, as the head of the WHO has said, where we are leaving to a few companies who decides and who lives and who dies. That's just not sustainable in the long run. And that's why we need to see this moves at the WTO to lift intellectual property during the pandemic happen, so that we can vaccinate the world, so we can supply safe and effective vaccines to every single country on earth.
Jeffrey, those critical of India and South Africa's proposal argued that the suspension of patents would not address the production and shortage issues that are currently plaguing vaccination drives globally. And in fact, this is going to hamper scientific innovation. Are they right?
Well, with regards to production, I mean, we're seeing production delays even in the high-income countries where they're not able to produce the vaccines fast enough by any means. So I think that any country that has the capacity to produce vaccines should be allowed. If that means suspending IP, then I think that needs to happen. If it can be done through agreements that don't require suspending IP through bilateral or other agreements, I think that that's the way we need to go.
Rajeshwari, India and South Africa are behind this push. Let's talk about India for a moment. Why do you think they're at the forefront of this movement?
Yeah, I think there is a lot of support for this movement. And because one of the key issues here is if there are any barriers to the access of this drug, of this medicine, then those barriers should be addressed. And IP, I think, is one of the key barriers. And it's very clear that, IP rights should be suspended, at least during the period of the pandemic, at least for the next 4 or 5 years, so that every person, every region on this earth can get the vaccine. If some countries are able to make it, then they should be permitted to make it, and IP should not become a barrier there. And it is this situation, this very situation, that has been envisaged in TRIPS, and that is why we have those provisions. So if we don't use them now, then when?
Right. You had a similar case yourself back in 2012 in the granting of a compulsory license for a medicine that we used in cancer treatments. Just tell us a little bit about that and what's different this time around with COVID vaccinations.
Yeah, sure. So in 2012, we had a product, there was a product which is called sorafenib, and that was used for treatment of kidney and lung cancer, kidney cancer and liver cancer. So that was costing about $3,000 to $4,000 in India, and obviously it was entirely unaffordable by the population. So we filed an application for compulsory license, and our application was considered by the controller. And at a royalty of about 6 to 7%, we were granted the compulsory license. So that was a case where the number of patients in the country was less than about 1 lakh. But here we're talking about a situation where there are millions and millions of people who need to be vaccinated. So there are different kinds of provisions under the TRIPS as well as under the Patents Act, which cater to these kind of situations. And therefore, I think this is a greater need there is a greater need in this particular era, in this particular situation, to invoke these provisions. And perhaps the respective governments should take the steps and perhaps suspend the patent rights.
But Max, what do you say? Max, what do you say to some in the pharmaceutical industry who say, look, we're already witnessing a sort of unprecedented level of collaboration already among companies so far? As you know, drug makers and manufacturers in the developing world include Johnson & Johnson with Aspen Pharmacare in South Africa, while we know that AstraZeneca and Kovacs have made deal with the Serum Institute of India, where we're speaking to Rajeshwari from. What's your response to that? There is already collaboration.
There's definitely some collaboration, but it's also clearly not enough. And that's what the head of the WHO said this week. We need to see much, much more manufacturing in developing countries at a much, much lower cost. You have a situation where countries like Uganda are paying more for their vaccines than the EU. This is not a sustainable situation. So we need to see much, much more investment in manufacturing. At the moment, we have a situation where rich countries are vaccinating one person a second, where the majority of developing countries have yet to vaccinate anybody. And we know that there are clear self-interested arguments for vaccinating the world, not least the fact that mutations from originating in countries like South Africa and Brazil are going to render our vaccines ineffective. So the safety, the security that people in the UK feel, people like my mother who was vaccinated a couple of weeks ago, the hope that we all feel when people are safely vaccinated could be dashed if we see these mutations spread before we can vaccinate the world. So we need to do a lot more, and it's quite clear that no pharmaceutical company so far has done enough. Some have done more than others. AstraZeneca has gone a lot further and done a lot more deals in developing countries. So it's not the same. It's not like they're all the same.
Right, but these companies would also say, Max, that while running these types of companies are expensive and without a profit, they're not going to survive. This is simply their business model that's been around for many, many years.
Yes, they would say that. But I think in this case, I mean, I would dispute that, but I would also dispute that, particularly in this case, all of the leading vaccine candidates have been hugely funded by public money, by taxpayers' money, and that has covered all of the risks of their investment, all the risks of their production. So it's simply not the case that they've risked lots of their money and they need to recoup those profits. And certainly not the levels of profit that we're seeing from the likes of Pfizer and Moderna, between a 60 and 80% profit margin on a vaccine that was based on research that was publicly supported in Germany. Same for Moderna, publicly supported in the US. It's simply not the case that their business model would collapse. And even if it did, why should we put the business model of this one industry ahead of the survival of humanity? You know, if ever there was a reason to question the defense of intellectual property, it is now, and we have to move fast and we have to vaccinate the world, and these companies are simply not stepping up.
Jeffrey, would you like to weigh in on this? I mean, these companies, obviously research and development is crucial, and making a profit is very important to them. That is how they survive. And tell us how much you think is spent on research and development when it comes to the coronavirus vaccine in particular, if you have that information.
Well, I don't have the numbers in front of me, but as was just said, I mean, through advanced purchasing and other forms of support, you know, governments, the public sector has been financing the development of these vaccines. I appreciate that the companies need to have profits and that some of those profits will go into further development, which we're going to need probably with the development of variants that can lead to resistance of the current vaccines. But I think it's time for the high-income countries to step up and say, well, we'll cover those costs, and we'll even pay for the difference in having vaccines manufactured at a lower cost in low-income countries if it means everyone can get vaccinated quickly. Because if we don't do that and variants do develop, then we're back to where we started with having to develop boosters or new vaccines and vaccinating everyone again. So it's really in everyone's interest to vaccinate the population as quickly as possible through whatever way we can. And if that means more public funds going to the companies, then I think so be it. Look at the amount of money we're losing by having the economy paralyzed right now.
Rajeshwari, would it be correct to say that even if this waiver that you're calling for, in fact, all of you are calling for, is put in place, then this will still not give access to other elements that are needed to produce vaccines, such as the know-how, such as regulatory filings. And for that to happen, you need direct technology transfer. Is that not correct?
No, that would be only partially correct, because you would have lots of companies who are already ready with the technology, because a lot of companies, whether they are in India or elsewhere, they already have the know-how in order to produce these vaccines. It is not that they're going to produce this for the first time or make these kind of products for the first time. But if IP is one of the barriers, then I think that's the barrier that we are trying to address and calling for that it should be removed. I would believe that. I would believe that. I'm sorry.
Go ahead, please. Finish your thoughts.
Yeah. So I was just saying that, IP is one of the barriers and that should be removed. These companies are the generic companies who are in India or in other countries are not without the technology in order to produce it. There may be some regulatory issues, but those are things that can be overcome very easily.
So do you think if the waiver does pass through the WTO, then is the outcome guaranteed? And what is that ultimate outcome that you're looking for?
One of the outcomes that we would look for is that without the fear of infringing on IP, a lot of companies in India as well as in other countries would be free to prepare the drugs, and perhaps we would have more number of vaccines which are available throughout the world. So that would really help us a lot, to get these things moving. For example, there are about more than 3,000 to 4,000 companies in India. So if there is an IP waiver, I would imagine that at least about 1,000 companies, if not at least 500 companies, would be able to manufacture these drugs and not only sell it in India, they would be able to export it to countries like Thailand, South Africa, etc. And that would really serve a lot. So at least a certain population can be taken care of. So, and the population that we're looking for is really, really huge. So this is the time, this is the precise requirement that TRIPS wanted to address. So if we don't address it now at this time, then we are too late.
Max, I see you nodding along to what Rajeshwari had to say. I mean, what do you think the difference would be that the waiver would actually make? Would it make that huge difference that some seem to think it might?
I think it's clear that it's necessary, not sufficient. So we need to get rid of these intellectual property barriers, but we also need to look at know-how. But I also think there's an element of kind of almost colonialism, this sense that only Western countries are clever enough to make vaccines. It's absolute fallacy. I mean, just last week we had a call with the head of a leading manufacturer in Bangladesh. He said he tried to approach Moderna, he was ignored, he could produce vaccines in 3 or 4 months, and he has state-of-the-art technology. It's just a simple myth that this is so complicated that only very clever American scientists know how to produce these vaccines. And as I say, it smacks of colonialism. What we need to see is a recognition that there is capacity and ability all over the world, but we also need to invest in more capacity. And we had the former head of chemistry at Moderna who left, saying that he thinks within 3 or 4 months you could repurpose existing factories to be rolling out these new mRNA vaccines in their hundreds of millions. So we need to invest in that now to tackle coronavirus, but imagine the world we could build with a distributed capacity all over the world to turn vaccines around very fast. If we do that, if we build that system, we'll be not only safer from coronavirus, but safer for future pandemics. Instead, we're using a very old-fashioned model of prioritizing the profits of companies over the people's vaccine. And that seems strategically strange. Just this week, we saw Tony Blair come out and say that it's in the strategic and defense interests of rich nations to invest in publicly owned vaccine manufacturing facilities, that we can't leave this to the market. So this is not not just an NGO campaign, or these are mainstream commentators who really believe that this is not the time to be putting the market interests ahead of the strategic interests of the world.
Right. There are those, obviously, that support them, but at the same time, the pharmaceutical companies and countries like the United States and some countries in Europe are digging their heels in, Max. So how do you sort of get over that? And I mean, just recently, there were some Republican senators who've also written a letter to the U.S. President Joe Biden, urging him not to accept that proposal by India and South Africa. So there is pushback.
There's definitely pushback, and I agree. And it's the power of the lobbying power of the big pharmaceutical giants is enormous. But we are also seeing cracks. As I said, Nancy Pelosi has come out, in the most senior ranking Democrat has come out actively in favor of the waiver, as have many other Democratic senators. We know that Anthony Fauci in the US, the chief scientist, has also said that we need to look at overcoming patents. And we do think there is progress in the US. We think in Germany, we've heard serious senior politicians question the value of defending IP at this stage. Remember, we saw the situation where the EU, some of the richest countries, are not getting the vaccines they thought they'd ordered because supply is controlled by these companies. So there's a real feeling that this system is not working. So I think we're starting to see cracks appear in the governments of rich nations. But yes, there are still some fierce defenders of IP. Boris Johnson, for instance, only yesterday said again that he thinks intellectual property is sacrosanct. So will we win this argument? We really hope so, and we will keep fighting for it. But I do think we are starting to see cracks appear in the politics of rich nations on this issue.
Jeffrey, do you agree? Do we see cracks now? And do you think that waiving intellectual property rights alone solves the COVID-19 vaccine access going forward?
Yeah, I think we are seeing some cracks, as was described. I don't think waiving it alone is the answer. Right now, we have a production issue. And I mean, I think, we could ask the companies, give them a very short timeline and say, if the IP isn't going to be waived, how can you scale up distribution? Which countries, which companies can you collaborate with? It's been really surprising to me to see how few production sites there are. We've known since summer that vaccines were, in their final, clinical trials. We've had already this year 4 vaccines approved, but still no one's really been thinking carefully about how do we ramp up that kind of distribution. So the companies need to come up with production. The companies need to come up with a production plan. And if they can't, then I think a temporary suspension that would allow other settings to produce the vaccine. And like was said, this is an important investment for those countries because this is pandemic preparedness moving forward. And if it's a financial issue, then I think the high-income countries should look at how they're going to invest in the companies for developing, boosters and new vaccines as needed if there's resistance.
I suppose some would say,
vaccines.
well, this is why the COVAX program, Jeffrey, has been put into place to supply vaccines to the less developed nations.
Well, it is, but we don't have the vaccines to really supply. I think that's the big problem. I mean, again, I'm in the European Union, and there's really very few countries that have even 5% of their population vaccinated, and we've been doing this now for over 2 months. So COVAX can work with the equity issue if we have vaccines, but we need to be producing those. And right now, in the middle of the pandemic, I'm less fussed about if they're being produced in low-income countries or high-income countries. I just want to see them produced. If we can support the production in low and middle-income countries, I think it's a wise investment. The
last question to each of you. Jeffrey, I'll start with you. Do you think the WTO is failing developing countries?
That's a tough question to answer. I think it's not just the WTO that needs to be considered. I think the high-income countries and the companies are failing the world right now because we're producing the vaccines so slowly.
Rajeshwari, what do you think about the WTO? Is it failing?
Yeah, it's not. I wouldn't say it's only the WTO. It's everyone. I think nations by themselves need to. They also have the power. It's not that, we have to wait for the suspension by the WTO, and only when the WTO will do a waiver, then only we can start.
Right.
The nations by themselves have the power to suspend the rights. If they think that there are patent rights which are coming in the way of generic production by several other companies, the company should just the nations should stand up and just waive those rights.
Max, last 10 seconds for you. Apologies, we've run out of time. Max, last words to you.
Rich countries are at fault. They should stop defending pharma profits and start getting behind a people's vaccine now. History will judge them unfairly if they don't do that. We need to see this people's vaccine, and we need to see the world made safe.
Thank you so much. We'll leave it there on that note. Thank you very much for joining us, Max Lawson, Rajeshwari, Hariharan, and Jeffrey Lazarus. Thanks so much for your time. And thank you for watching the program. You can see all our previous programs anytime, of course, by visiting our website, aljazeera.com, for further discussion. You can always go to our Facebook page. It's facebook.com/AJ Inside Story. Join the conversation on Twitter. Our handle is AJ Inside Story. For myself and the whole team here in Doha, thanks for watching. Bye-bye for now.